One of the problems often that come from our educational system in the United States is we have a tendency to kind of gloss over certain subjects and then kind of move on and then talk about other things instead. One of the things is basically the idea of equal rights, civil liberties, civil rights. We have a tendency to think the United States is a little better than it actually is because we've been selling ourselves this American exceptionalism idea for quite some time that America is the place that does all those things that, like European countries would never dare to do. To make things better, to really pay attention to other citizens. And while in certain cases that's not wrong, what the problem actually is like I said, we tend to gloss over a lot of the problems that we have, focusing only on the good things and then pretty much kind of forgetting to mention that, we have some things we could definitely improve. So before we even start about talking about equal rights, let's talk about a couple of delineations that are really important to understand. The difference between civil liberties and civil rights, because quite often the two get mixed together and people keep thinking they're the same thing. So just for the sake of understanding, civil liberties are freedoms that are guaranteed to us by the Constitution that basically protect us from tyranny. So like the Bill of Rights, or think freedom of speech, those sorts of things, those are civil liberties. Those basically are given to us written in law in order to say these things you basically can't infringe upon. While civil rights, they're legal rights that protect individuals from discrimination. So it's kind of within the constraints of those particular rules and laws that kind of protect each individual from having, government make onerous approaches to them that they're not supposed to be able to make, but they would do differently from one citizen to another, if that makes any sense. So let's talk about equal rights, civil rights, and kind of why they're really important to the United States. Well, to understand that, you kind of have to understand where we came from. And I don't mean England or the European countries, but yeah, a lot of the origins of where we are today kind of came from there. But I'm talking about pretty much the time before we became a country and then became a country, because we set forth a whole bunch of different doctrines and ideas that basically we brought things with us that it would take many, well, 100 years or so in order to kind of get better. And we still had to continue doing that even more after that. Give an example, slavery. In the beginning, sorry, my throat's kind of going out on me. In the very beginning, when we formed this country, we literally had a two-sided, juxtaposition in the way things were going, wherein half the country thought that, slavery was a good thing because it was economically feasible and helped their economy at that particular time, whereas the other side was basically saying slavery was wrong and therefore it shouldn't be part of the system. And so it ended up becoming a north-south separation. So if you were in the north, basically you were anti-slavery. If you were in the south, you were pro-slavery. And so, which kind of makes sense, like I said, economically, because economically the South relied on slave labor in order to, pretty much get everything done, whereas the North didn't. The North being more of a industrial powerhouse to where it didn't need it. So a lot of they brought in like automation and other sorts of things like that. And then basically, if you wanted to work in the North, basically you were free. And that's kind of how it went forward. And so what ended up happening is every time we brought in a new state, we usually had to bring in two states. So one that was pro-slavery and and became a slave state, whereas the other one basically became a non-slave state. What a time to have a a throat problem, eh? Okay, so basically, over the years, we've kind of had many different interpretations of what was happening back then. One of the strong, Northerners of the time, although he was from the South, was well, doesn't matter where he was from, but Thomas Jefferson. He's often been criticized for the fact that he owned slaves. So yeah, he was in the South, but he had more of a northern disposition of kind of people thought he was like anti-slavery because basically the mindset that comes many years later kind of takes the similar aspects of what would happen if you were supporting a abolitionist, which is to get rid of slavery, approach rather than the Southern approach, which was to be pro-slavery. So without getting into the nuances of that, we'll talk about that when we actually get to the differences of kind of what happened throughout time. But that'll be in another module. So let's continue back on with the idea of so after Jefferson, it took a long time for the country to realize that both slavery and non-slavery was not going to actually work. And so this took, a number of years. I mean, the country was formed in the 1780s, and so, or at least our first constitution. And so what ends up happening is we have I'd say kind of another revolution, which is our Civil War, which happens in 1865, around that period of time. And so it takes us a little while, and then literally it takes us about another 100 years before all of the ramifications of that come to pass, such as the Civil Rights Movement. It literally doesn't happen until the 1960s. So, like I said, these take long swaths of time over the United States history, but eventually kind of lead us to where we are today. And so I'm not saying we're perfect today, but we're still having problems today that are literally all kind of tied to problems that we had in the past. And so all along throughout this whole process of getting rid of slavery and offering more equal rights to other people, which at least at that time was, not to be a slave as opposed to be a slave. So that was considered equal rights then. Like I said, it takes until about the 1960s before we actually start focusing on, the right to vote, the right to, marry who you want to marry, stuff like. So I mean, all these sorts of issues kind of come as an evolution of the whole, argument over whether or not equal rights should be granted to more and more people, which, according to the original doctrine of the United States, was something you wanted for everybody. It just took a little while to figure out who was going to be treated as part of everybody, if that makes any sense. So one of the first attempts to actually make a difference, which is the Abolitionist Movement, happens about 1820. Missouri was a slave state, or was brought in as a slave state, but then Maine was brought in as a non-slave state. And so, like I said, they kept doing these separations as they went through. But in 1820, or pretty close to around the same time, there was an attempt to make, it's not really equal rights, is basically the United States, the people of the United States didn't want to actually deal with the issue. So their solution was, well, if people want equal rights, they can go to another place and get them. And so they they basically created a country called Liberia in the 1820s. And so 88 former slaves moved to Liberia and pretty much created their own government. And so part of the, I guess, it's not really a problem, but part of the concern that's ever come from that is there's a lot of people to this, even to this day, who keep pointing as Liberia as, well, if you don't like it, you can go to Liberia, or Liberia was a solution that didn't work. And well, part of the problem is they didn't give any economic, back support to Liberia when it got formed. Like the United States really didn't do anything for it, so basically it fell into a corrupt regime and has been a pretty much horrible place for anyone to live today. And so when people take a, you know, a casting finger and point at Liberia as look at the mistake that happened when, you know, they tried to make a difference. They didn't really try to make a difference. They basically just tried to kick the can down the road, as they tend to do with most of these types of issues, and they have in the past. And they still do today. I mean, as you can tell with the numerous riots that we've had over the years, they tend to happen because people get really upset that nobody actually wants to do anything about these specific issues. And so it takes time for people to realize what's wrong and then actually do something about it. And you end up having to change minds of people over time, because the people who didn't want to do anything in the beginning are still the same people teaching the next generation not to want to do anything going forward. So you have that kind of resistance that exists within our system. So let's go away from race and talk a little bit about gender, because during the same period of time, the women's movement was starting to move up, meaning women wanted the right to actually vote. And so women participated in politics at the time, usually through their husbands. And if you weren't married, generally you didn't really have too much of a say-so in government. But what ends up happening is women start stating, why don't they have a voice as well? And so in 1848, we have what's called the Seneca Falls Convention. And it was a bunch of women getting together and deciding, you know, what would they do in order to move forward? And so what they had decided at the time, the women who were gathered at this convention, was they would focus on the abolitionist movement first, because that's kind of what they were doing. And so they were going to basically help make things better for the slave population, to get them their freedom, you know. And so once they got them their freedom, they would get the vote. And then the expectation was that the minorities that they actually helped in order to get back into the system would then turn back to them and give women the same kind of assistance. Unfortunately, what they discovered, and this is kind of a sad commentary on how the history worked, is as African Americans actually got the right to vote, what ended up happening is when the women's movement kind of moved towards, you know, okay, now it's us, how about helping us, you know, get the right to vote, they still had a large population of men within the African American community who didn't support them. And so basically it became a men versus women thing. And so you helped us, I mean, we helped you before, you need to help us now kind of sentiment never actually made any stance. And so it takes until the 1910s when they start to try to get some kind of support support that they had asked for before or got promised before. And so they end up trying to get a whole bunch of different states to enact voting laws to let women vote. And what ends up happening is one state would get the right to vote, and then after a short amount of time, it would basically lose it again. So it just kept going back and forth. So it literally takes until the 1920s when there's actually, you know, the 19th Amendment, where basically they make it happen, you know. And so once it happens, it basically changes everything. So, but like I said, in the process, it was to help slaves gain their freedom. And so basically the Civil War takes place. And so those constitutional arguments of 1789, you know, whether or not, you know, who should get freedom, who counts as a free person, all that, those kind of come to the forefront, you know. And literally the South secedes from the Union until the North forces them back into the system. And then without the Southern presence in the Congress, because they seceded, abolitionists were actually able to put forth a really strong anti-slavery legislation. And that's when the Emancipation Proclamation comes about. And basically it frees all slaves, but it freed them in Confederate territories only, which is kind of an interesting thing. But remember, the North didn't really have a slave population, so it wasn't that much of an issue. So after the Civil War, we have what's called the Reconstruction Period. And part of the problem with this is it was designed, at least on paper, if you think about it, in order to bring the South back into the system and to force civil rights or equal rights to the people who were never given it before. But it ends up becoming more of an economic thing. So it's like a lot of carpetbaggers, which is people who basically took advantage of all of the money that was kind of being funded into these different systems. And so governments kind of remained military districts in the South, basically until the federal government decided that they were now up to speed on kind of the way things were. Some states took a really, really long time, and some states never really recovered. So there are a couple of our southern states, if you look like Alabama and a couple of the others, Louisiana, to where they have recovered financially, but there's still a whole bunch of problems that are still present in the system that they never really got past, because remember, the people are still the same types of people. And it takes time to change the minds of people. And if you're not really doing anything in your local area to change things, or around, change mechanisms, then basically there's very little incentive for change to actually happen. So it takes a while when you're talking about kind of that sort of system kind of working in place. So, but let's talk about some of the things that do happen after the Civil War. So we have three really important amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. So the 13th Amendment banned slavery in the United States. Okay. 14th Amendment was the equal protection and due process for all U.S. citizens. So the idea that you really can't, do something for one group of people, but not do it for some other based on, arbitrary reasons such as, skin color, and eventually that gets interpreted to gender, even sexual identity. The 15th Amendment, which basically enfranchised all newly freed male slaves, which meant that enfranchisement means they could vote. And so before they were not allowed to vote, and now they were allowed to vote. And so part of the problem with that is again, like I've mentioned, you've got locations where they were never really happy about giving people rights in the first place. So when they got the right to vote, they started instituting all sorts of draconian processes to make sure that they couldn't vote. And so they put in poll taxes. So like, if you didn't pay a certain amount of money that to the government, you ended up having to not be able to vote. Or they put in tests. So you go in to take your voting. You'd go in to vote, and basically they'd give you a test, and if they didn't want you to vote, they'd give you like impossible to answer questions, or just tell you got the wrong answer even if you got the right answer, and there was nothing you could do about it. And so that kind of stayed in place for a while until a whole bunch of different cases go through the Supreme Court. But again, that takes decades in order to happen, and some of those cases were still kind of moving along, even in the middle of the 1900s, so like 1950s, 1960s, it was still kind of happening. So these are quite often a couple of terms that they use for them. One is called Jim Crow laws. So it was a different status for whites and African Americans at that time. Or black codes, which is basically it limited voting for freed slaves. The idea was they weren't really citizens, kind of a thing, which is, now we look at it and we go, how could people even think that at that time? But remember, this is a time when people basically weren't offering any rights at all, and basically were enslaving half the population, or that segment of the population, and didn't seem to have any problem with it back then. And so it's very hard to change the mindsets of people kind of going forward. And so there's a whole bunch of civil rights cases that happened in 1883, or at least they started there. And basically, they instead of dealing with trying to bring people together, they started doing a whole bunch of separation things. So that's kind of where you hear the term, separate but equal. And so if you wanted education, they would say, well, people can get, equal education in different institutions. So they would open a African American institution, a law school, and if you're African American, you could go there, but you couldn't go to like Harvard or some other, white, Caucasian only kind of a school. And so the arguments back then, and there's a case that kind of comes about that makes that happen. It's called Plessy versus Ferguson, which had more to do with railroad seating than anything else. That happens in 1896, and it sets up this whole idea of separation based on color, and it's the whole idea of the separate but equal, which again never really was a serious thing. It was just an attempt to not give benefits to people that you didn't want to give them to. And so that kind of stays in place for quite some time. And so those ramifications still exist today. I mean, they're not allowed to do that anymore. But at the same time, people who didn't get educated at really good institutions were not given the opportunities going forward. So like when they finally opened up the doors for these institutions, well, it's been taking a lot of time to basically get the numbers of people there, that will make a difference going forward, because you still have the numbers of people who graduated that really haven't changed, because it takes years and years to graduate, and it's not easy to get into these institutions in the first place, even with all the best standards and everything. So basically the idea is most compromises were separate but rarely equal. So a lot of African American law schools weren't all that great, like they didn't have the good books, or they didn't even have books sometimes. And so it's basically they made do with what they could. And so, I mean, you had a few HBCUs, historically black college and universities, that kind of picked up some of the slack. But again, they were kind of limited on the resources they had available to them, because they were literally drawing on other African Americans to support them. But remember, the African Americans who could support them didn't have the good jobs doing that, because they didn't go to the good schools to begin with. And so this takes a very long time to start turning around. And we're still not there, but we're probably better than we used to be, if that's any positive to it. But so during this same period that I was talking about, the women's movement basically bows out of supporting any more of the equal rights institutions that have nothing to do with gender, because basically they got abandoned, and so they had no reason to kind of stay and continue to fight for them. And so what ends up happening is you have a bunch of different ramifications against women in general. And so the idea is that women generally get discriminated upon even further. And there's always all sorts of really sad reasons for it, or sad justifications for it. One of them, in fact, comes from a future, or at least at that time, future Supreme Court Justice, Brandeis, who basically, in a case called Mueller versus Oregon, it happens in 1908, he basically argues that women should not be given the same rights as men, because they're quite often, and this is more for like military service and all that, because they're judgmental, or they get hot and bothered and stuff like that. And so he brought in all of these really bad scientific studies. And so there's literally, it would never pass scientific, scrutiny today. But at that time, basically, he just threw so much at it during this case to the Supreme Court. And so they basically sided against women and did not go for giving further rights. And so Mueller versus Oregon actually ends up being kind of a bad mark in the movement towards the women's right to vote. And so Brandeis brief is quite often used now as a term that's a erroneous kind of piece of information that basically gives misleading information. And so kind of a sad legacy to leave behind, although he did many much better things as a Supreme Court justice. But unfortunately, you sometimes get tied to the things you did in the past, and that's probably the most famous thing that goes along with his name. So for the longest time, women generally basically have to go it alone because they don't have any assistance from those that they helped in the past. Like I said, during their attempt to help the African-American population gain equal rights, they didn't get that reciprocated when they were looking for voting themselves. And so literally it doesn't change until about the 1920s. There was well, we'll talk about that in a second, which is the Equal Rights Amendment. There was an Equal Rights Amendment that was, to give women the same rights as men. And this is after they got the vote in 1920. And basically it kind of fell apart. And the reason it fell apart was kind of the same Brandeis kind of arguments, which is, women are volatile, can't, respond well to pressure. And so none of this is true, and none of this has any justification, in any scientific, social, or natural in any way, shape, or form. But again, these kinds of sentiments, these are people who've been thinking this way for a long time, and quite often these are the same people making a lot of these decisions. But going back to equal rights and civil rights, because we start moving towards, whether or not, people should be equal, even in the school systems that they go to. And we have a case in Little Rock, which is, remember I mentioned Plessy versus Board of Education, or Plessy versus Ferguson. Basically, because it was the law of the land, we have what's called precedent, which means if the decision was made in a previous case decided by the Supreme Court, that's the law of the land going forward until the Supreme Court decides otherwise. Usually they don't, because they're all usually decided on some kind of legal issue rather than whether something's right or wrong. And so what ends up happening in 1954 is we have a case called Brown versus Board of Education. And so the attempt was to, no longer have separate schools for blacks and whites. We were going to get them all together into the same school. And so the Supreme Court turned around and said, this has to be. And they said, so we must do this right now, and put forth their ruling. And the states did nothing. They just kind of sat on it and said, well, nobody said we had to really do this at any particular speed, so we'll get around to it when we get around to it. So in 1955, which is a year later, the lawsuit kind of comes back up again, and it's often called Brown 2. So Brown versus Board of Education was one. It's actually Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And then Brown 2, which is 1955, the Supreme Court rules again and says, look, with all deliberate speed, it must happen. And so Berger, who's the Supreme Court justice at the time, gets together with the rest of his Supreme Court justices and decides, we've got to do this unanimous. It's got to be a 9-0 decision because this is that important. And if we don't do this, it's never going to happen. And so because of this, because of the pretty much the power of the Supreme Court and the entire Supreme Court, Truman, who is our president at the time, literally backs up the students with the National Guard. So the local police tried to stop the students from coming in because they basically didn't want equal rights going on at the same time. And so tried to stop the students from coming in, the African-American young students from coming in. And so it became a standoff between the National Guard, and basically in the regular army. So it was literally pretty close to blows and shooting. But then basically the National Guard and the regular army, sorry, the regular army and the National Guard. So the regular army gets called in and actually escorts them into the school. And that's literally what you have for the first, couple of weeks of school. So that must have been a pretty trying time, but that's kind of what was going on. Now, as much as this is our historical record and we know all about it, part of the problem with this is we have this really bad tendency to think, well, it was a few bad apples that let this happen. But the majority of America was actually backing the wrong side of this throughout this whole process. So it took time to change the minds of people. That's why all of these previous decisions kept happening, is because people thought that way or felt that way. And so it takes time for people to start going, okay, that's wrong. We need to start doing something about this. And so that's literally what happens. It takes a while. And so the mind of the people changes, but it takes time. And so there was quite often a lot of justification for physical force by the police departments, because they would look at people protesting and saying, these are just bad people. These are young, bad people, and once they grow up, they'll learn better. And we still have that today. And so it's one of those problems of America. And we tend to gloss over that one as well. So it's kind of important to think about, because such events like this can happen again, and not too long ago have happened. So, and as I hate to say it, will happen. So that's part of one of the sidetracks of America that we really have to pay attention to kind of going forward. So let's talk about a couple of the acts that happened that come from Congress. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. This outlawed arbitrary discrimination in voting. It barred discrimination in interstate commerce. Basically, it used the Department of Justice to desegregate schools. So judges would be put in charge of these different school districts, and they would stay in charge of them until they cleaned up their act. And some of them did not, gain their freedom, until the 2000s. So, I mean, this goes on for quite some time. And so there was no Fed funds for discriminatory programs. There's not supposed to be any discrimination in employment. And it created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So these are some of the things that kind of come about. But not everything moves deliberately as we'd like to. So one of the problems that was happening during this period is there were attempts to not even explain the story of what was going on. There's a case that happens in Mississippi. It was the television station WLBT. Every time they talked about the civil rights movement, what they would do is they would black out the whatever the broadcast was that was coming from the national network, and they would say, sorry, we're experiencing technical difficulties. And they'd wait until the civil rights coverage was over, and then they would start covering the information again, whatever the other stories are. And so this became a real problem until basically what ended up happening, there's a kind of a sidebar to this story, is a group of African Americans put together a coalition of businesses. They ended up buying WLBT and pretty much firing everybody, and then it's been under new management for years, and it's kind of changed its ways. So, I mean, you have that sort of thing, but like I said, it takes time. And sometimes it takes those kinds of movements in order to have these sorts of things happen. Because a lot was going on in the 1960s. It's just there was a strong attempt to pretty much push everything under the rug and not really pay attention to it. Again, our country is really, really good at kicking things down the road, kicking cans down the road. So after that, basically, like I mentioned, there was the Equal Rights Amendment. So this is all happening during the same period. And so basically it was going to bar discrimination against women by federal and state governments. remember, this doesn't bar individuals from actually doing things, but just federal and state governments. And then eventually we start interpreting a lot of those rulings to actually go for companies can't do these sorts of things as well. And so Supreme Court has kind of gone back and forth on how they decide on those particular things. But the Equal Rights Amendment was actually ratified by 22 states before the Roe versus Wade argument kind of came up. And then once Roe versus Wade came up, it basically changed a lot of different opinions. And then there was an argument as to whether or not women should be drafted. And it literally kind of killed the Equal Rights Amendment at that particular time. Like if they did it right now, it probably would have passed. But what ended up happening was a lot of the states actually unratified the amendment that they had decided to ratify. So like I said, 22 states decided to do it. Then Nebraska and Tennessee basically pulled out. So two of the southern states basically just didn't like the idea for it. And so once they pulled back, basically it wasn't able to actually happen. And then 3 more states basically pulled out and rescinded their votes. So the ERA, even though it was a strong attempt to make happen, and there's still attempts to make it happen again today, it basically has died unratified. So let's go one more year after the original Civil Rights Act. We have what's called the Voting Rights Act, and that's in 1965, so it's a year later. It prohibits discrimination in voting and registration. There was a case called Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, and basically invalidated Section 4, which limits the focus of the act. So there are certain things you can still do, but you can't do, if that makes sense. And part of the problem is much of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is still being challenged today, and some of those cases are now approaching the Supreme Court, and we're starting to get rulings almost every year on different little tiny aspects and pieces of it. So that could change pretty much, on the next decisions of the Supreme Court. And then the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which basically deals more with housing. And so discrimination in housing is addressed and challenged. The idea was to address civil rights based on race, religion, ethnicity, or sex. That's really all that was actually about. There's been attempts to revisit the ERA, as I mentioned. Part of the problem is there's a kind of a polarization approach to it, which sometimes the issues have nothing to do with gender issues whatsoever, but have more to do with, where you stand politically and as to whether or not the arguments will move forward. And these arguments end up getting coaxed or coated with so much around it that have nothing to do with the arguments themselves, that sometimes they get defeated before you even start talking about the actual issues being brought up. So those are some of the main points with equal rights. There's a couple of other representation problems that are really important kind of moving forward. We're still dealing with sexual discrimination cases as to what to do with them. The recent movement, has been seriously brought into the forefront due to a couple of cases involving like Kavanaugh and even Biden running for president, and had a number of issues that all have to deal with sexual discrimination. So whether or not those get addressed and how they get addressed have a lot to do with how those particular movements get interpreted. There's other ethnic demographics who basically don't get a lot of representation or any type of attention whatsoever. And so like there's also Native Americans. Problem with Native American cases is most cases never tend to go anywhere. And part of the problem for that is there's not a lot of representation. And so nobody knows who represents what group. So you may have, one group saying we represent Native Americans, or you have another group says we represent, the Cherokee Nation. And when there's no real consistency and ties to each other. It's kind of the, divided we fall issue, where if they don't have any, ability to get together and put together some serious support, people who make decisions don't have any reason to make the decisions that they want. And so one of the other issues that's kind of still a huge issue that's kind of going back and forth and is gaining more momentum, and that's gays and lesbians and transgender and all sorts of other types of representations. So those types of cases are getting more and more attention going forward, and where they fall in everything has, again, a lot to do with how America deals with these sorts of situations. So one of the other little things that kind of comes up, and it's coming up a little bit more with some of the recent problems they've been having, but like the District of Columbia, there's always the question of whether or not should they even have any representation, considering it's a group of Americans that don't have a state. And so therefore they literally have all sorts of problems taking place and no one really representing them other than, a member of Congress at the most. And then again, we still have tons and tons of affirmative action problems, such as how much you should interpret it, how much should be done, how much is already being done, and how much is, has been overdone. And so all those different issues keep being brought up to the forefront. So that's an idea of kind of what to focus on equal rights. It's a lot of information, but hopefully it's helpful. Hopefully it was helpful, and we'll get you going forward. Thank you.